First and foremost, card games are businesses. That's kind of tough to say, and it is a hard pill to swallow because we want to think of card games as games. But the way that companies can sort of continue to make sets and do tournaments and expand on the game and its reach, they have to profit. And what I mean by this is that they have to make better and better cards. Now, this is called power creep. I'm sure many of you have already heard of it, but basically power creep is the unofficial term used to describe how every time there's a new set release, they theoretically should be better than the last batch of cards. And without power creep in a game, the game basically dies off because people will only buy the really old cards the first time when they come out, and then they'll never buy any new cards. And while we can sort of complain about Konami sort of power creeping Yu-Gi-Oh too fast and stuff like that, the fact of the matter is that power creep has to exist for a game to thrive. If no one's buying cards, then the company that's producing the cards has no reason to make more cards or invest in tournaments. They need to make money somehow. But sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes, cards actually go through a reverse power creep. And what I mean by that is that sometimes cards get much, much better a long time after they actually come out. And this video was suggested in the community tab status that I made a couple days ago. I keep mentioning it, but there really were so many fantastic ideas, and this one I thought was perfect because I really thought it's interesting to talk about. So we're going to talk about 3 cards and 1 deck that have all been reverse power creeps. So we're going to talk about cards that weren't very impactful when they came out, but suddenly, like 5 years later or 2 years later, they became really, really good. So first off, let's talk about Instant Fusion. Now, I talked about this briefly in my Cyberdark Impact video because Instant Fusion, like a couple other cards that have been reverse power crept, started out in one of the quote-unquote worst sets of all time. Now, Instant Fusion, for its time period, didn't really accomplish anything for a couple reasons. First of all, there were no other extra deck mechanics besides fusion monsters, so you couldn't leverage Instant Fusion into more plays. But more importantly, Instant Fusion at that time period basically was just a way to put a tribute fodder on the board, and most of the decks that were playing tributes back then had plenty of other good ways to actually do that, either through Soul Exchange or Treeborn Frog or something along those lines, but not really Instant Fusion. There wasn't a huge reason to play that because that's all it did. Pretty much every single good fusion monster that you could summon off of Instant Fusion back then was banned or simply didn't exist, which meant that Instant Fusion had no utility besides putting one monster on your board to tribute off, because the really high impact fusion monsters hadn't come out yet, or like I said, if we're talking about like Thousand Eyes Restrict, they weren't allowed to be played in competition. So how did Instant Fusion go from nothing to a whole bunch of something? Well, it first started in synchros because Instant Fusion was really popular in the Karakuri deck because people would use Instant Fusion to summon a Cybersaurus from their extra deck so they could start fusion synchro summoning for the Karakuri synchro monsters. But you needed a level 5 monster to start your chain of synchro summons because they had a lot of level 3 tuners. So that was sort of the first big instance, and we did see it pop up some other times with synchros, but Instant Fusion became really popular with the release of XYZs, because with Instant Fusion you could instantly put like a level 4 or level 3 monster on your board to instantly make a rank 3 or rank 4. And a lot of people only think of Instant Fusion in regards to Norden, but plenty of Infernity lists played it just to summon like a Fusionist or any of the level 4 like a Kabazal Warrior. They used it just because they needed to make Lavalval Chain and Levier the Sea Dragon so badly that they could afford to take a -1 to summon it, because that deck was so prevalent on sort of comboing off once you got to that first XYZ summon. So that's why Instant Fusion became really popular, and that wasn't until years after it came out. That was a pretty far gap. We can also look at 2 cards out of Starstrike Blast. That's a set that a lot of people know, but Starstrike Blast was only printed a very limited amount of times. It's really hard to find Starstrike Blast cards even to this day, unless they've been reprinted outside of it. There's also been a ton of cards that sort of had huge price spikes from this set, like Vanity's Emptiness, and that's going to be the next card we're talking about here. Vanity's Emptiness was not good when it came out, simply because not every deck really needed to special summon that much to actually win the game, and there were a lot more pieces of spell and trap card destruction back then. But for Vanity's Emptiness to be good, and this is really, if you look at all the times that Emptiness has been powerful, for it to be good, the main thing decks have to be doing every single turn is special summoning. They don't have to be using spell and trap cards. They don't have to be normal summoning really high impact cards. If a format exists where all the main decks are only doing special summoning or mostly doing special summoning, and that's like their main goal is just to special summon as much as possible, well then of course Emptiness is going to be very, very good. But if you look at when the card came out and people were playing synchro decks, you can simply just like summon a Thunder King and then you don't care about your opponent's Vanity's Emptiness. And there were a lot more stun decks back then as well, such as like Gadget Stun was really popular for years, and that deck doesn't really care if your opponent has Vanity's Emptiness. That was also released at a time that Royal Oppression was still legal. I don't believe it was at more than one copy per deck, but it definitely was still being played. And that was pretty crazy too, because Royal Oppression was basically a better Emptiness without the drawback. And even when Royal Oppression was banned, though, people didn't just immediately start going to Emptiness. But Emptiness finally became good. I mean, it's hard to exactly pinpoint it, but I think the first big success was in the 2013 WCQ, where Patrick Hoban won the event, main decking 2 Vanity's Emptiness, because it basically auto-won the Dragon Ruler mirror match. If you look at Dragon Rulers, they played almost no normal summons. I mean, they had the Baby Rulers, but you're trying to use those discard effects. And if you chain Emptiness to your opponent discarding for a Baby Ruler, not only did you give them a straight -2 in card economy, but you also locked them out of playing the game at all, which was absolutely insane and definitely played a huge part in Hoban actually winning that event. For the next card is, well, the next card is also in Star Strike Blast, is what I'm trying to say here, and that is Droll and Lockbird. A lot of people know about this card nowadays, and it also was decently popular as a side deck pick against Spellbooks back in 2013. It's kind of funny that 2 Star Strike Blast cards became really popular in the same year, but this card's obviously really good now, but it wasn't good at all when it came out. I mean, like, just way worse, like way worse than Emptiness, worse than every other hand trap when it's been released pretty much, because Droll and Lockbird can only exist as like a popular pick in formats where a deck's entire identity revolves around searching like a million times. Like if every single card in the deck searches, then Droll is good, because Droll doesn't actually impact like the field at all. It doesn't even negate a card. Like it negates cards your opponent hasn't activated yet. So Droll can be pretty risky if decks are only playing a couple pieces of searches, because that means that they'll search, you'll use Droll as a straight -1, and then your opponent might not even have other cards in their hand that can search them more cards, which means you just took a -1 for nothing, and in those cases it would have been better to play a different card. But now that we have decks that are fully investing in every single card, searching other cards, Droll is obviously a good choice. I don't think Droll will always be a good choice. I don't know if that makes it not ban list worthy, just because it's not always going to be good. It does take a very specific format. If we look at cards like, or decks like Spellbooks that searched every single turn, or decks like Nekroz where every card essentially just searched other cards, or nowadays we have decks like Spirals, and even sort of Trickstars. I mean, Trickstars, it's good against Trickstars because you can hit the field spell and they can't Canadia, but it's also good in Trickstars for the Reincarnation combo. But the main reason people playing Droll right now is that decks like Spirals and Pendulum Magicians, all of their cards are just search other cards in the deck, which makes a card like Droll really effective, because Droll is the most effective when you can activate it after your opponent does their first search, and you can turn off their entire hand, and for the first time in a while, that's actually very possible. It's pretty likely that if you Droll your opponent and they're playing Spirals, that the other 4 cards in their hand aren't going to be activatable, because they're just going to be all search effects, which makes Droll basically like a stop your opponent's turn entirely card, which makes it pretty crazy. Speaking of Spirals, that's the deck that got reverse power crept, and it's kind of funny in retrospect because these cards are all busted. Well, mainly Spiral Quick Fix and Spiral Resort. Those cards are both so insane. We're talking about non-hard ones per turn effects and crazy search effects and making all your guys immune to targeting. That's absolutely incredible, and no one really played the deck because none of the Spiral strategies really fit into what that format of Yu-Gi-Oh! Was looking for. More specifically, Spirals were a Link summoning deck created a year before Link summoning, and it's so obvious in retrospect. That's why I said that, because if you look at the deck, like, none of it makes any sense. You have all these cards like Quick Fix and Super Agent and like Drone, all these cards that are different levels. None of them are tuners, and you can't really overlay for anything impactful, because like rank 1s don't really do anything, and like they're abusable by machine duplication. They all have non-once per turn effects, and you like look at those and you're like, wow, that seems like a really great way to build advantage, and then you figure out that, oh, there's nothing I can do with this advantage until, of course, we get link summoning, and it's like, oh, that's why this is broken. Yeah, using machine dupe to search 3 cards and make a double helix and search like 3 more cards is a little crazy, and that's when spirals truly get busted. So spirals, sort of like instant fusion, were better because of a new mechanic that hadn't come out when they were created, but I think we can now look at spirals and pretty concretely tell that Konami made them with the specific intention of them being an incredibly powerful deck once Link Summoning came out, because they are so clearly designed to be abusable with the Link Summoning mechanic that when we look at it nowadays, we can see, like, yeah, of course these cards were going to be broken down the line. It just took a new mechanic coming out, and obviously Konami prepares their new card mechanics quite a while in advance. I'm sure that they knew what they were doing. With Instant Fusion, I'm not so sure, because Instant Fusion was released a long time before Synchro Summoning and a really long time before XYZ Summoning, but I still wouldn't put it past them to kind of know the direction the game was going. But anyway, that is going to wrap up this video on sort of the reverse power creep. Let me know what other cards you guys think had this reverse power creep happen to them. There's some out there. Not all the cards. I think in general cards get better as time goes on, but sometimes when new mechanics come out, it makes old cards really, really powerful. But I will see you guys later. Bye.